Avowed is a decent game. If you liked 2000s role-playing games like the BioWare Golden Age, or even if you just liked New Vegas or the mechanical parts of the Outer Worlds, you'd probably like Avowed. And you might not know that based on where the discourse has been. Avowed released to good initial reviews. Then again, when haven't these quote-unquote reviewers not said the latest thing they've been given advance access to and a press kit for not said it was good when the wind favored their takes? That does not seem to have pushed copies though, so maybe we should stop giving these guys perks for being professional glazers. Avowed has, as of writing, peaked at 19,000 concurrent players on Steam with 230,000 viewers on Twitch. For reference, Dragon Age Veilguard peaked at 89,000 on Steam and 170,000 on Twitch, and Starfield peaked at 330,000 players and 543,000 viewers. I illustrate this point that a lot more people got their eyes on Avowed compared to playing it than normal, and that's because this game was anti-marketed and consumers were, expectedly, skeptical. Oh, they marketed it, but it's not the easiest game to showcase. In this video, we're going to be talking about the release of Avowed and potentially analyzing the game at a later date because I can only describe this launch as a disaster. This game has ugly character models. I don't think anyone will deny that, but the weird part is that it has ugly character models in the first two areas. This dwarf area has actual characters that look like people, which begs the question, why did Obsidian choose to open with the blue Concord furry man? Most people who are streaming this game are obviously going to start in the first area, which means these are the character models their viewers are seeing up front. This is what consumers are seeing, which is a bad idea because we live under a paradigm of aesthetics-oriented critique. Once upon a time, there was a group of people on the internet who made their money by complaining about sexism, usually by taking surface-level glances at games and seeing sexually attractive women, and claiming this was teaching boys to objectify real women. Now we're getting the inverse, a group of people on the internet making their money by complaining about sexism by taking surface-level glances at games, and seeing ugly characters and claiming this is done for woke reasons. That's right, I am fence sitting. When the streets flood with feces, you gotta get some elevation up on a fence. Not that it matters because I'm down in the shit either way. These anti-woke inquisitors go from topic to topic, making their money by shotgunning takes and usually just posting screenshots they see on their Discord server or Twitter mentions. It's all surface level critique, but that has generally paid off for them and bled out into the broader gaming discourse. Dragon Age Veilguard is a great example of this. It's pretty easy to see that beyond a few hours that they may have streamed to make content, they rely on lone individuals biting the bullet and uploading cringe clips or screenshots to get their takes about how woke the game is. And don't get me wrong, Veilguard is a stinky game. I didn't need some guy to tell me this when Inquisition exists. Inquisition was, for its time, the game made to appeal to the social justice crowd of the decade prior. And so it's the least surprising outcome that its sequel is bringing that energy, but updated as the movement has changed. It was progressive back in 2014 to have an in-universe word for trans people, but in 2024 that's now considered problematic. What's funny is that Obsidian is assuredly woke to some degree. I mean, its art director had the crazy take that 30 frames per second is something to be targeted, which is insane because this game is absolutely unplayable at that frame rate. Even walking around environments, something the art director is responsible for, is not good at a low frame rate. When this game actually runs at 60 frames minimum, it can be enjoyable. It's 2025, it's time to accept that the industry doesn't want 30 frames per second in an action-driven mechanical system. If I'm running around with a sword and flintlock pistol throwing fireballs at people, 60's the minimum. But that's not the crazy take some may know about. But what's strange is when I streamed on this topic, most of the people calling Avowed woke didn't hear the art director's position on how he chooses what race he wants to hire and how he desires to be ethnically replaced. No, to all the people calling Avowed woke, this was apparently a shocking revelation. To them, Avowed is woke because it has the ability for the player to change their character's pronouns, and ugly non-player characters. Again, superficial observations you'd get from the most minimal amount of effort or investigation. But Obsidian did set themselves up for this, or at least on the ugly character charge. They had years to change how they wanted to open their game, and they picked the blue furry man because the art director wanted to make Elon Musk mad. No, seriously. Like, I'm not upset that people who were basically told they are intended to be mad at a game's launch were mad at a game's launch. Obsidian didn't disavow these statements, despite the fact that this is not a particularly woke game when you actually sit down to play it. Well, anti-woke inquisitors consider New Vegas and Morrowind to be woke for having gay characters, so Avowed at a minimum will hit that metric. But if having a gay character makes something woke, then why your own comments are woke? Turns out hating your players is a proven strategy to not sell copies, who knew? And Veilguard selling worse than Dragon Age 2 is proof enough that the market intended to replace the toxic gamers has never manifested. What bugs me about this is that it is a tragedy. Avowed is a better game than Veilguard, it shouldn't be doing worse than it. Of course, the anti-woke inquisitors are just the vultures picking at the bones of an already dying game. They aren't the murderers themselves. Although they took the earliest interest, what with needing to make rent this month and being the only people in the industry who apparently knew or cared that this game was coming out. But pretty much every incidental conversation I've had about this game would have at least one person chiming in invoking the woke thing. When it turned out that pronouns and ugly characters weren't convincing enough, the discourse was shifted to comparisons. Everyone loves comparisons because it's trivial to line up two shots and post a take. I did it in less than 5 minutes, making a joke that regenerating mana in video games was a thing in Skyrim and not Avowed. Ergo, Avowed is a technological step backwards. I don't believe this, and I've said as much that non-regenerating magicka can make a magic system more engaging. But it was enlightening to me how trivial it is to make this point for the outrage I could drive by doing it. I've said before that everyone loves comparison and not her ugly sister contrast. Contrast is the act of asking the question, why is this different? Obviously that takes effort. You have to think about it and engage with the problem. Sure, it can be a compelling point that Avowed is definitely a step backwards in aspects of life simulation in first-person role-playing games. The first example is stealing and assaulting NPCs. 99% of NPCs will not comment if you steal items, food, or even money from in front of them. There is the odd occasion where they do, and that makes the lack of generic theft acknowledgement feel even more awkward. You also can't assault characters at random, or without first starting conflict in a dialogue, meaning some NPCs are effectively immortal as far as the player is concerned. Now the question, why is this different? Well, maybe they didn't have the time to create a crime system, guard responses, and jailing. This game was in development hell after all. You should hear some of the things they pitched, like, Destiny-style co-op in a Skyrim-like was one of the ideas they had in pre-production. Maybe they decided that the player, being mostly a crime-free person prior to starting the story and a diplomat, shouldn't be able to be sent to jail. After all, Commander Shepard in Mass Effect doesn't go to jail either for stealing and all that, even during the parts where he isn't a Spectre. But obviously, Mass Effect also limits how often the player can overtly steal, and you aren't allowed to attack generic NPCs and settlements. Shepard can shoot at the occasional non-combatant in a mission, and his bullets will just phase through them. Most of the time, he just raises his gun and you aren't allowed to shoot. Most people accept that as being fine. I doubt anyone has ever taken points off because BioWare didn't have a crime system. Obviously, if you don't want players stealing for an RP reason, don't put stuff to steal everywhere. Don't let the player pull out their weapons in settlements. This could have complications though, which is more than anybody participating in the discourse would even know about. Exploring and looting is part of the gameplay in Avowed, and there is occasionally combat with NPCs in these urban areas. It wouldn't matter anyways because people would complain even then that they are arbitrarily being kept from drawing their weapons around the woke NPCs. People will dedicate themselves to complaining about slop and then advocate for the universal design blueprint where every game needs to have parity with every other game. Avowed has been labeled a Skyrim killer, by gamers obviously because this is an incredibly stupid term. Halo killer and WoW killer were investor terms designed for projects that aimed to take the online player bases of those games. You can't kill Skyrim because it doesn't have a live service player base you can steal. And even then, we already got one in Red Dead 2, which leaned more into the life simulation aspects than Bethesda did with Starfield and had tens of millions of players. Funny that we're forgetting about that. Although Starfield fans are trying to co-opt the situation. I guess misremembering history that the media and YouTubers were extremely positive towards Starfield during its initial release, and it was only after a couple months that people started to air criticism because they had had enough time to not just judge the game at the absolute surface level. They've been generally trying to revise history that people hated Starfield at the launch in a way that just isn't the case. I'm doing a New Vegas and Fallout 3 comparison and contrast at this very moment. Well, not literally this very moment. And one interesting thing is that Fallout 3 uses Radiant AI to have NPCs hang out, converse, all that, whereas the average New Vegas NPC is a fairly static character. Some have advanced schedules, many don't. And that wasn't a problem for most people. In fact, I doubt many people even noticed. Starfield has almost zero Radiant AI left now. I say almost because I don't know with authority if it has zero, but it's basically not there, and the only people I saw who even noticed were people who also obsessed over Bethesda one way or another. I don't think this alone is a good reason to not buy a game. Obviously, a Radiant AI system is just not something Obsidian is interested in doing. If you want to do a good comparison, compare the fact that stealing and killing anyone you wanted was a thing in the Outer Worlds, because, you know, Obsidian made that game and not Skyrim. That would, of course, require someone to actually own the Outer Worlds and remember this particular mechanic of it. And I forgive you for not being in that category. Despite how well this game sold at the time, people just don't talk about this game very much because they don't want to admit that it is dog shit. Avowed is a much better game than the Outer Worlds, but going by the metrics of what people claim to care about online, you'd think it wasn't because the Outer Worlds has NPCs enter a murderous rage because you stole a bag of chips in front of them. This style of comparison video became a genre during the game's 5-day pre-release period. Even a YouTube drama channel was getting in on the action. I call it a pre-release period because calling it early access apparently confuses people into thinking it's an actual early access game, but no, they mean you get early access relative to the full release date. Pre-release access has been a trend lately in gaming. The biggest potential fans of something will pay extra to get in ASAP, and start posting positively about the game on social media. It's like free marketing. Or even better, being paid not to market. In fact, it is. Slash the marketing budgets and send those savings to the investors. Only problem is when you make that period 5 whole fucking days and release a game that has ugly characters, bland looking gameplay, an extremely slow start, and is ripe for comparisons to Skyrim that you yourself recognized as problematic and tried to dismiss in interviews. Yeah, it turns out publicly saying multiple times that this wasn't going to be like Skyrim isn't going to stop reviewers from making that comparison. I've read online that such comparisons are inevitable because I guess Bethesda just gets to own the first-person fantasy genre now. It really is funny. Obsidian is a company that was known for making sequels to BioWare games. They did a single game for Bethesda, and now that's all anyone thinks of. But yeah, this game is inherently difficult to make look good in a video. I'll admit it, the gameplay looks way worse than it feels, because at the surface level it just looks like a slightly more complex version of Skyrim's paddle spam combat. You know that thing people do when they'll say, people thought the gameplay of X game was bad, and then they post the most boring clip imaginable? That's every Avowed gameplay clip. And it doesn't help that even Obsidian themselves didn't know how to market this. Whenever they showcased the gameplay, they would show dueling or a 1v1 encounter. This game is not good at 1v1 encounters, it's very boring. This game is good at massive encounters where you have to fight a dozen enemies at the same time. But they also showcase the gameplay for dads. Like, I don't blame anyone for watching this and thinking, this is possibly the most boring game I have ever seen. Especially with what all has been coming out, surely they'd try to come up with some way of making this game look more appealing. Like, lean into the magic gameplay, show all the effects and stuff that the other games this is competing with might not necessarily even have a counter to. And a common consensus I've read online was that a lot of people seemed to not know it had even come out until people were posting about it, which makes sense given the marketing material had failed this game. So in all reality, the murderer was the usual suspect, Microsoft. Which is not surprising. Game Pass exists so they can claim to have millions of players on their investor calls to cover up for the fact that they've been perpetually losing full dollar sales over the last 5 years. A common thing I've read is that Avowed is priced too highly, so if it wasn't a $70 game, it would be fine. And it's hard to disagree. I mean, Enshrouded is pretty good at scratching the mechanical itch of an RPG, and it's only $30. Obviously, the reality is that consumers are choosing between their groceries and a AAA title. You know, when publishers started pushing for the $70 price tag, that price increase was wiped out in just 9 months of inflation in 2020. The problem with making an inflation argument related to the price of games is that while costs have been going up, wages have not. So people are still in the mindset that $70 is expensive, despite what well-paid financial analysts at publishing firms and dudes on Twitter are saying you need to think is a reasonable price. But I finally figured out what was bugging me about the monetary figure argument, and it was that I consistently see people justifying paying as much money as Avowed costs for much worse games. Also, I've been forced to spend money on my other hobbies lately, and let me tell you, $70 does not go far in most hobbies. Anyways, buy it or crack it, I don't think individual sales are going to salvage this mess. The game director said it's a success, so I'm sure we can look forward to Obsidian closing down, since Hi-Fi Rush was also a success, and look what Microsoft did to Tango Gameworks. She's just doing what every Microsoft executive is expected to do: gaslight. She has to keep the ship running long enough that they can ship fucking The Outer Worlds 2 in the same year. Yeah, did you guys think that maybe splitting Avowed's development up into another project as a sequel to a game that any market research would have indicated no one actually wants was a bad idea? Anyways, I hope to talk about the actual game in another video, hence why this is a second channel thing, but I have a thing coming up that is going to be a serious deadline to any side project I'm working on. Like, no joke, I cannot renegotiate more time on this one, so maybe I'll just talk about the magic and leveling system.